Thomas Owens stopped Julia on the main street on a Thursday morning, the land office paper in his hand, and his voice pitched to Carrie. The children were beside her. Luke had the flower list. Ada was holding the edge of Julia's coat, the way she did when she was uncertain about something but did not want to say so. Thomas said what he had come to say. He said the claim was beyond her now. He said a woman alone could not keep the residence and improvements a homestead required, that the land office would see it plain, and that he was prepared to help settle the matter cleanly if she would be reasonable about it. He said this where the feed store and the dry goods and the post office could all hear, which was the point of saying it there and not at her door. Julia let him finish. Her hands stayed at her sides. She told him the land was hers and the children's, and that she intended to keep it so. She said it once, without heat, and did not say it again. Thomas folded the paper back into his coat and rode out. The street did not empty, but it rearranged itself the way people do when they want to appear not to have been watching. Frank Hale was on the boardwalk across the street with a paper bag of fittings he had just collected from the hardware. He had heard enough. He did not cross the street while Thomas was speaking, and he did not call out, and he did not place himself between Julia and her husband's brother. That was her ground to hold, and she had held it. But when Thomas's horse had turned the corner and Julia moved to put the flour sack into the wagon bed, the sack slipped and caught on the rail. Frank was there before it fell. He set it squarely in the bed without a word, stepped back, and touched his hat brim once. Julia looked at him for a moment. Then she gathered the children and drove home. That was Thursday. Friday morning, Frank came past on his water route, team moving slow, barrels full. He hauled for 3 homesteads between town and the creek, and kept his own situation narrow by design. A rented room behind the livery, the team boarded in the stalls below, 2 blankets, a trunk, and enough space for a man who had not yet built a household around himself. He had known Julia's husband the way neighbors know each other out here. By the work, by the wave across a field, by a borrowed tool returned without being asked for twice. He saw her at the fence line. He pulled the team up. Julia was checking the north posts, working down the run. She did not stop when she heard the wagon. Frank set the brake and climbed down and came to the fence without being invited. He looked at the post she had just reset and pressed it with his hand. It held. He moved to the next one and pressed that too. Then he looked at the house, where the curtain in the window was not quite still, and asked, "Would a husband on paper keep him off your land?" Julia did not answer right away. She pulled the wire taut on the next section and checked it. It would have to be filed quickly, she said. He knew that. He told her what he could put on paper and what he would not ask from her after. He looked toward the house once more when he got to the last part. "The children stay where their father is buried," he said. "That is the shape of it." Julia looked at the fence line. A long run of it still needed work. The stock had been restless for a week. Thomas Owens' voice was still somewhere in her ears, loud and measured and certain of itself. "Come to supper," she said. "We'll settle the rest after." He nodded and went back to his wagon. She went back to the fence. He came at dark and ate what was put in front of him, and did not comment on the house or the children or the way Julia ran her table. When the plates were cleared, he laid out the rest of the practical shape of it, what he would bring, what he expected nothing of, what the land office would need to see. Julia listened. The children listened from behind the curtain that divided the sleeping area from the front room, which everyone in the room was aware of and no one mentioned. When he was done, Julia said, "The claim stays in my name, and theirs. "That is the arrangement," he said, "and the house stays mine to run." Frank nodded once. "The barn will do. I meant to say so before you had to." She looked at him for a moment. "Then we're agreed." He picked up his hat and went to the barn, and that was the first night of it. Before the next week was out, the marriage had been filed and witnessed and recorded. After that, every shared trip to the feed store and every sack of flour loaded onto his wagon, and every time they stood within 10 feet of each other on the main street, had been watched and measured and carried home. People who had made up their minds about Julia's chances revised quietly and without acknowledgement. People who had made up their minds about Frank Hale studied him with new attention. The ones who had known Thomas Owens longest watched all of it and said nothing, and waited to see which way it would fall. Julia felt it every time she came to town, the particular quality of attention that means everyone has already talked and is now watching for the next piece. She held her chin level and ran her errands and did not give them anything extra to carry home. Frank seemed not to notice, or seemed to have decided not to. He loaded the wagon and checked the wheels and held doors and drove them home, and if people were looking, he did not arrange himself differently for it. At home, the house was adjusting to itself. Frank rose before light and had the stock tended before Julia had the stove going. He did not eat breakfast at the house the first week. The second week, Julia left a plate on the porch rail without comment, and he took it without comment and left the plate washed and stacked by the door before he took the team out on the water route. He came back near dusk most evenings, the barrels empty, the rims crusted with ice, and the horses blowing steam in the cold. That was how that was settled. The children watched Frank the way children watch something they haven't decided about yet. Luke studied the way he worked, how he set a post, checked a wheel, moved through the morning chores with no announcement and no wasted motion. Ada watched from doorways and from behind her mother with the full, unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to want things quietly. Frank did not try to win either of them. He simply came every morning and did the work and thanked Julia for the evening meal with the same 2 words and went back to the barn. He answered questions directly when the children asked them and did not manufacture reasons to speak to them when they didn't. Luke moved first, the way older children do, not with warmth but with assessment. He appeared at the fence line one cold morning while Frank was working the north run and stood without speaking until Frank handed him the far end of a wire and showed him without words how to pull it taut and hold it. They worked that stretch in silence. When it was done, Luke looked at the line of it, straight and even, and went back inside without a word. He was at the fence line the next morning before Frank had started. Ada moved differently. One evening in November, she climbed down from her chair after supper and went to the shelf. She took Frank's tin cup, the one Julia had put there for him the first week, on the high shelf with the others, and carried it carefully to the table and set it beside his plate. Not at the far end where he usually sat, beside Julia's. She climbed back into her chair and picked up her spoon, and ate as though she had not done anything particular. Julia saw it. She said nothing. She filled the cup when she filled the others. Frank sat down, looked at the cup, and thanked Ada quietly. She studied her bowl with the serious expression of a child managing a feeling that is running a little ahead of her. Luke looked at the cup and looked at his sister and went back to his supper. After the meal, Frank went to the barn. Luke stayed at the table and whittled something that hadn't found its shape yet. The fire settled. Outside, the wind came down from the north and moved along the walls of the house, and the house held against it, and the stove did its steady work, and it was a quiet evening. Thomas Owens came by later in November. He stood at the fence line, the north run, the one Frank had spent 3 days resetting after the filing, and he spoke to Julia about legal provisions and what land office examiners generally thought of arrangements made in haste and what certain neighbors might be willing to say if asked. Frank was on the porch mending harness. He did not stand up, he did not walk to the fence. He kept his hands on the leather and his eyes on the work, and Julia handled every word of it herself, which was what she needed to do, and what Frank seemed to understand without being told. When Thomas had finished, Julia told him the land office would have its answer in the spring and wished him a good ride back. Thomas looked at Frank once before he turned his horse. Frank looked up from the harness. Nothing in his face moved. Thomas rode out. Julia came back to the porch and sat down, and picked up the mending she'd been setting aside for a week, and the afternoon went on around them in the ordinary way. It was December, a gray supper, the wind picking up outside, when Ada set her bread down and asked without looking up whether Frank would keep sleeping in the barn after the landman was finished. The table went quiet. Luke said her name. "I was just asking," Ada said, and picked up her bread again. Nobody answered her. The question sat at the table through the rest of the meal, and everyone knew it was the right question, and everyone knew it was too early to say, and Ada had understood both of those things before she asked. She had asked anyway, because she was 6 and because she wanted it in the room. The hard weather came late in December and kept them all inside for 3 days running. Frank fixed the cabinet hinge that had been pulling since October. He resoled a boot by the stove light. He sharpened every tool in the place and hung them back in order on the wall without making a point of it. On the second day, Luke came and sat near the workbench and asked something specific about the team, a technical question, the kind an 8-year-old asks after thinking about something quietly for a long time. Frank answered the whole of it. Luke asked another question. Frank answered that one too. They were still at it when Julia called them for the midday meal. She stood in the doorway and watched them come in from where they'd been crouched over a piece of harness, talking in the low, focused way of two people working out something that matters, and she turned back to the stove before either of them could see her face. That evening, after the children were in bed, Julia sat at the table with the mending, and Frank sat across with a piece of harness that still needed attention. They worked in the quiet, and the stove put out its steady heat, and the wind pressed at the walls and did not get in. After a while, Julia said the south posts would need work before the hearing. Frank said he'd seen that and would get to them when it broke. She nodded and went back to the mending. He went back to the harness. The fire settled, and the evening went on. The land office hearing was in January. Julia had her documentation in order: receipts, improvement records, sworn statements from 3 neighbors who had watched her work this land through a hard year and were willing to say so in writing. Frank drove her to town. They did not discuss what she would say on the way there. She knew what she would say. Thomas came with a man from the county seat who carried a leather case and had the manner of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room. Julia laid her papers on the table and walked through every item without hesitation. The improvements, the acreage, the fencing dates, the summer work recorded and dated in her husband's hand, the autumn and winter work in her own. When the man with the leather case suggested the claim might have lapsed in the interval before the marriage was filed, she showed him the dates and explained the arithmetic to him quietly and without hurry. The man set his pen down and looked across at Frank. "And you claim interest in the property through marriage?" Frank kept his hands folded on the table. He did not look at Thomas. He looked at the examiner. "I claim the work," he said. "The land is hers." Thomas Owens looked at the floor. The examiner said he would review the file and issue his determination before the thaw broke. Julia thanked him, gathered her papers, and stood. Frank stood when she stood. They walked out into the January cold and climbed into the wagon and drove the 12 miles home, mostly quiet. The road was frozen hard, and the team moved well, and there was nothing that needed saying that the hearing had not already said. February pressed down hard on everything. Frank was up before light every morning for the stock, and Julia heard him go out, and heard him come back. The sound of it had worked its way into the shape of her mornings, the way the stove and the children's voices had, without a decision being made, without a moment she could point to. One evening she found him standing at the north window after the children were in bed, the temperature dropping outside, watching the far post lean in the freeze. She came and stood beside him. She could see what he was looking at. He'd get it in the morning, he said. She knew it. They stood there for a moment. The wind moved across the field. The fence line held, mostly, against it. Julia was aware of him beside her the way you are aware of a post that has been reset and holds. Not with surprise anymore, but with something that had replaced surprise gradually and without announcement. She went to the stove and put the kettle on. After a moment she heard him pull out the chair at the table. They sat together in the warmth while the cold pressed at the walls, and neither of them said anything more, and the quiet between them had changed enough from the first nights that Julia noticed it and let herself notice it, and did not look away. The determination came in March. Contest dismissed. Claim confirmed to Julia Owens, secured for her children. She read it at the table. Luke read it over her shoulder. Ada watched Luke's face, and when his breath came out, she let hers out too. Julia folded the letter and set it on the shelf where she kept what mattered. Frank was outside at the far post, working it back to true in the thaw. She went to the door. "It's done," she called. "We kept it." He stood up straight. Something in his face settled, the way a man looks when he has been holding something carefully for a long time and can finally set it down. He nodded once. Then he went back to the post. She went inside. Ada was at the table drawing shapes in spilled flour with one finger. Luke came in from the back and sat down and picked up the horse he'd been carving since December. It was finally starting to look like one. Spring came slow and then all at once. The fields opened. The stock grew easy. The north fence line stood straight in the new light and needed nothing urgent from anyone for a while. In April, on an evening warm enough to leave the door open, the four of them sat at the table with supper done and the dishes not yet cleared. The children were restless with the good weather and would be outside soon. Julia looked across at Frank and said that the claim was settled now. His name had done what it needed to do. He was not obligated to the arrangement any further than he wanted to be. She said it plainly and looked at her hands when she said it. Frank was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup on the table once. "The south posts are still soft," he said. Julia looked up, and the roan favors her left foreleg when the weather turns. Ada looked between them. Luke did not move. Frank set the cup down. "That is not obligation." Julia held his gaze, long enough that Ada looked between them again, and then went back to her bread, losing interest in a thing she did not yet have the words for. Julia reached across and moved the bread plate toward him. "Then stay as my husband," she said. "Not for the claim." Frank looked at the plate between them, then at her. "I will." Luke picked up his cup and said nothing. And that was how it was settled, at the supper table in plain sight, with the evening coming in through the open door. By the time the evenings had stretched long enough for the children to stay outside until supper, the place had the sound of itself again. Stock lowing behind the fence. The gate Frank had rehung in October swinging clean on its new pin. Ada's voice carrying from somewhere past the garden. Luke on the porch step with the carved horse, which he would not say was finished. Frank's wagon came down the track at dusk, and Ada heard it before anyone. She came from wherever she'd been, and moved toward the sound of it without being called, not running yet, but close to it. Julia stood at the open door. The light was going soft and gold over the fence line, and the land that had nearly been taken from them lay quiet under the evening sky. Luke came and stood beside her in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He watched the wagon come in, and the mare toss her head, and Ada break into a run across the last stretch of yard, her voice going up as she went. The stove was warm behind them. The plates were set and waiting. The south posts would need checking before summer, and the stock would need moving to the far pasture by the end of the week, and there was enough flour for 10 days, and not much more. The barn stood quiet and dark at the edge of the yard, its lamp unlit for the first time since October. It was an ordinary evening in all the ways that mattered, and it was theirs. And that was the story of Julia, a widow who kept her land, raised her children, and found something she wasn't looking for along the way. Let me know in the comments if you liked it. Thank you.